So again, forward cloudsec, really, we can't do this without the help of our sponsors. They pay for speaker dinner, they pay for our audio visual, they pay for a lot of things. And so we want to thank Tracebit. Tracebit is a silver sponsor. Tracebit deploys cloud canaries and honeypots for intrusion detection. They've built something really quite novel that leverages Terraform to scatter resources. You know, think S3 buckets, IAM roles, decoy secrets all around your AWS accounts to catch bad actors. And so coming up next, Katie Knowles. I couldn't read that. I was too smart.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Welcome to Hidden in Plain Sight, Abusing Entra's Administrative Units. My name is Katie Knowles. I'm a cloud security researcher with Datadog. I primarily focus on Azure. And today, I wanted to share how administrative units work for a couple of reasons, both because you might want to use them, but also because they can be used for some sneaky privileged persistence that you might not already be aware of. Advanced features like this are becoming more popular for attackers to look to once they have access to an environment. And I just want to make sure that we're keeping aware of how they can be used maliciously in the wrong hands. Just as a disclaimer, this talk does not contain any vulnerability disclosures. It's just using a feature as designed. I know that's quite common to say when working with Microsoft products, but these features, they lead to legitimate things that people need to use, right? A lot of these are born out of legitimate enterprise concerns and needs that just can end up being used in a different way when we think creatively about them or when someone else thinks creatively about them. Let's talk about what they are a bit first. We're going to start real basic on the recap here. When we talk about Azure RBAC roles, we're talking about permissions granted over Azure resources. They're always going to be granted over a subscription or a group of subscriptions or a resource group, something to that effect. You might be familiar with names like owner, reader, virtual machine contributor, things like that. Entra roles are a bit different. Entra ID, which was formerly Azure AD, if you're more familiar with that name, grants you permissions to manage the directory side of things. So if you're used to password resets, being able to read directory information, the ever desired global admin role, those are all going to be under Entra ID. Like we mentioned before, when we're working with RBAC roles, there's always going to be that scope involved. You're going to have to assign it over something. You can't just say, like, over everything by default. And so combining the user and the subscriptions with that RBAC role assignment of owner, contributor, stuff like that, leads to our Azure RBAC role assignment. What administrative units do is something similar for Entra ID. Prior to using administrative units, you'd have to assign a role across the entire tenant. So if I wanted to give you in the back the ability to reset user passwords, you would be able to reset everybody's user passwords across the entire tenant. And maybe I don't trust you that much, not just yet. So I want to be able to scope that role assignment down to just a couple of people that are on your team or in your region. Let's talk about this a little bit more visually. Let's say we've got this tenant of a bunch of users and a classical role assignment of user administrator across the entire tenant. This would be a standard role assignment. On the flip side, a user administrator that's scoped to an administrative unit in Canada would only be able to manage those users in Canada. So I might have gotten someone to help me out in Toronto with my tech. I don't want them to handle accounts in Switzerland. Using an administrative unit with what we call a scoped role assignment, we can create that scenario where they can't handle all the accounts at once. But the global user administrator, again, can still manage that. I'm taking a little bit of time here because we'll get a little bit silly pretty fast on these. To create administrative units, something I also want to mention if you look into them, dynamic filters are quite helpful in that you can do something like if somebody has a country of Canada, add them to the administrative unit. This is helpful because you can't add a group into an AU. You just have to add users on your own. So looking at this more from the research side, there were a couple of things that really stood out to us as funny. One is the restricted management administrative unit feature, which has been in preview for a little bit. And the other was this hidden membership parameter. This was mentioned as just a flag of visibility that was usually null But then in some examples, for this Seattle District Technical Schools, for some reason they might want it to be set to hidden membership, but that wasn't documented anywhere. What's up with that? Let's talk a little bit more about restricted management first. So the Restricted Management Administrative Unit was introduced to help protect sensitive accounts. Some tenants might have VIP users. Maybe you've got a CEO who's particularly targeted. Maybe you've got some VIP administrators, and you want to make sure that they can't be handled by just anybody who has that password role. So instead of scoping every single assignment here, what we can do is use a Restricted Administrative Unit in order to protect those accounts from being modified from tenant-level assignments. In the example we were looking at before, where the user administrator scope to the tenant could manage all the users, including those in Canada, in this example, you'd only be able to manage the accounts in Canada if you had a scoped role assignment over that administrative unit. So changing that logic a little bit, instead of tenant scope or administrative unit scope, now it's only the administrative unit scope. Just a little look at how to create them. If you have that is membership management restricted true parameter, it'll be created. You can also do this in the Entra portal. So this feature is possible to see when you're playing around in the web portal. You don't necessarily need any crazy tools to set it up. And once we've done that, there'll be this warning that says this user is a member of a restricted management administrative unit. Management rights are limited and restricted. And this is the view as a global administrator. If I came in to try to deactivate this user, we would still be seeing that we can't reset the password. We can't revoke their sessions. And this is not something we would expect to see. We wouldn't be able to touch this account or modify this account until we had removed the restricted administrative unit and until we knew what that even was and what to do about it. For hidden membership administrative units, again, this was the one that was a little bit less clearly documented outside of the parameter showing up. It means the membership of the administrative unit can only be viewed by certain privileged roles and the members of that administrative unit. So if I'm included in that scope, I can see who's in it. If I've got a certain privileged role, I can see it. But what roles exactly does that include? It turned out these 9. We'll talk about that a little bit more because it's a very specific and strange list. But a lot of roles that you would expect to be able to see, the members of this weren't in that group. So security administrator, security operator, password administrator, roles that you might have as a security analyst could not see the members of a hidden membership administrative unit. And we'll talk about the implications of that a little bit further on. Something else to mention is that the hidden membership property is not shown in the Azure portal in any way. You have to know to look for that property on an administrative unit in order to see that it's hidden. And you have to set it up through the API like this. So with a post request, you'd add visibility hidden membership into the creation of that administrative unit, and then it would be created with hidden membership. But aside from that, there's no way to do this. To look at the behavior side of this, once it's been created, a global admin, which you'll see on the left, can see the members of the administrative unit. This is the same AU on both sides. The security admin cannot see anybody. And you'll notice they don't have a warning or anything to that effect. It's just, oh, it's empty. I guess there's nobody in it. But how do we get that list of 9 roles? I seemed really confident about that. What was up with that? That wasn't documented anywhere. My expectation going into looking into this in more depth was that surely with 488 graph permissions and 109 assignable Entra, built-in role templates like global admin, that they would have some kind of alignment between the permissions that were assigned to them and the API actions that they were associated with. That was naive. Unfortunately, this was a lot more complicated than I thought. The best I could find for a statement from Microsoft was that your best bet is to rely on the directory role permission descriptions and find the graph APIs that you feel would align with those. It's kind of a creative process. There's no direct mapping at this time. For a little bit more research into how these permissions don't line up the way we expect them to, I highly recommend the 2 articles below, one on how Entra roles might not be what you expect them to, one on graph permissions. They're just really good to understand the differences between these permissions as well. And I'll show those links again at the end. But basically, we can trust no one, is what we've concluded here. So 597 service principles later, creating one identity for each of these, whatever the 488 plus 109 was, and assigning one permission to each user, and then making the API call to fetch the membership of an administrative unit, the hidden membership administrative unit, and seeing what came back, we got this. Only 9 built-in Entra ID roles could view the hidden membership administrative unit, the ones that we talked about before. A lot of other ones, 84, could see the AU itself, they could access it, but it had that empty response that makes it look like, oh, nobody's in it, it's okay. 16 of the roles just didn't have the ability to view the administrative unit. That's okay, it's pretty expected to not have permission to look at certain parts of the directory. What I found really surprising here was that for graph permissions, which are quite granular, 484 couldn't view it at all, it was restricted. That's okay, that's fine, but the 4 that you thought would have full access to administrative unit properties, they just got that empty response. They saw that blank content we saw before. So administrative unit.read.all and directory.read.all and the read-write equivalents for those could not view the hidden AU members. In terms of the permissions that these came from, I've got a couple of them listed where it was pretty clear there was a permission that related directly back to administrative units in these cases. The other 6 roles, I really tried to figure it out. There was not an obvious commonality between them and the permissions that were assigned to these roles to make me think, oh yeah, that's it. You also can't assign every permission to a custom role. So just a little bit of context, these names you see are built-in role templates. A custom role is one where you assign your own permissions and then give it to people, and you can't assign all of them for testing. So if anyone can figure this out, be my guest. I personally couldn't find it, and I think that's good enough for now, right? That was a little bit of an adventure. So to recap, administrative units allow assignment of specific Entra roles to admins over users, devices, group objects. They limit the blast radius of that assignment, and they're very helpful to make sure that you're not assigning a permission to everybody over everything when it comes to your directory. A restricted management administrative unit changes the logic up a little bit. So whereas before a regular administrative unit would be if someone has a tenant role or a scoped role assignment, all right, let them have it. That's their permissions assignment. The restricted management administrative unit, you specifically need that scoped role assignment in order to modify that user, in order to protect our sensitive accounts. And the hidden membership AU, I'm not sure why it's there. That's all right. But it hides the membership of an AU from all users except those 9 administrative roles that we talked about and its own members. Cool. About that privileged persistence. We're going to talk about a couple different scenarios and then look at the combined impact of them. Something to note, I mentioned a lot of privileges are needed for this. Scenarios require having global administrator or privileged role administrator. So you pretty much would have needed to compromise the whole tenant at this point. There's been a lot of attacks, though, that kind of deal with what can we do to throw people off once we have that level of access, to maintain it just a little longer. And so that's why I still want to talk about these. We're going to look at these techniques in Stratus Red Team, which is a free open source, not a product, just something that we offer to emulate different attack scenarios and help build detections around them. I highly recommend playing with it if you haven't already. For Forward cloudsec EU, we've added Entra ID support with some really interesting app techniques along with the 2 scenarios that you'll be seeing here today. So you can take this, go home, build it, and try it out in your own test tenant and see how it actually works. So in our first scenario, maybe we've got access to this tenant already, we've compromised it, we have another user we want to protect for the future, either someone that you've compromised or a backdoor account that we've created. In this case, we'd create a restricted administrative unit, the restricted management one. We'd place the backdoor user in that restricted administrative unit, sort of giving it that protection that we saw before. The impact of this, an attacker could come back, use that backdoor account, and perform their actions on objective. Meanwhile, an admin coming to investigate this could not disable the account. Now there's that caveat, right? They can delete the restricted management administrative unit, wait for that to get cleaned up, then come back and handle that user. That's going to take a lot to figure out. You're going to need to get a global administrator involved in the first place, and then you can do it. So this is taking precious minutes away, and we have to figure out what the feature does in the first place. Looking at this in Stratus, we've got our console on the left for Stratus. We've got our Azure portal on the right. And what Stratus is going to do is create a user for us that is in a restricted administrative unit. So we'll see that we're refreshing. I feel like this is playing faster than I thought. So unfortunately, you got that at X2. I'm just going to do this again really slowly. We've got our creation. The user that is being created is placed in the restricted administrative unit that we've had created to put this in. So you'll notice it looks normal. The administrative unit gets created. We can see the membership of it. And if we go back to the user, refresh the user, that status shows up, that now we can't touch it. We've got properties grayed out, delete grayed out. We cannot reset the password anymore without undoing this configuration first. And this is as a global administrator. All right, that was a lot easier, not at 2x. Our second scenario involves hidden membership role assignment. So how can we kind of hide the permissions we've got from the blue team a little bit longer? An attacker would create a hidden membership administrative unit. They'd add a couple target users, not too many, right? Because members can see who's in the group. But maybe we've got a VIP, we've got a couple admins with high privileged roles. Add them into that hidden membership administrative unit, and then grant our backdoor user the role privileged authentication administrator over that hidden AU, so over the users in that AU that we've just created. Privileged authentication administrator is fantastic because it means when we come back with our backdoor user to access the environment again, we can not only update a target user's password, but we can also clear their MFA methods. So this effectively means that I'm going to take the password I just reset that user to, log into their account, and it's going to say, oh, this is crazy. You don't have MFA registered. Would you like to set that up? And so from an attacker perspective, we get full access to the account, even though MFA was previously configured. We'll perform some actions on objective. A security analyst coming to look at this will not be able to view the AU members. They might see the logs that it was created. They might see the logs that someone was added to it. But when they go to look at this in the Azure portal, the AU is empty. There's nothing to tell them that it's a hidden membership. Oh, yeah, you might not be able to see it. No, it just looks empty. It looks like, oh, maybe the attacker already, fixed this, or they didn't want it anyway. I don't know what's going on here. Taking a look at that in Stratus at 1x. Again, we'll have the console on the left, the Azure portal on the right. We're going to create a couple different users in this scenario. One will be a target user with global administrator over the directory. So if we refresh a little bit, they'll eventually come up. And if we scroll down, we look at the assigned roles, global admin, and then that resource name directory just shows the scope that the user has. So it's a very wide scoped assignment, right? It's exactly what we want to target. And then the backdoor user now has the assigned role of privileged auth admin over the hidden administrative unit. That's the scope of that assignment as opposed to the directory. If we look in it, we can see the target user, but that's with a global admin. If we shift to a different tab where we have a different view, it looks completely empty. So you'll notice the security admin role has no ability to view this membership at all, and we can refresh it. We can go back and forth to convince ourselves that this is the case. We're looking at the same administrative unit, and to one user, there's membership, and to another user, there's not. Potentially combining these scenarios, we could create a lot of confusion. So think about looking at this from an investigation perspective. You get an alert, and you're trying to figure out what's going on. The attackers created a restricted, why not? Let's make it hidden membership as well, administrative unit. They've placed their backdoor account or their target user in there. And so now we've got that level of protection, right? The account can't be immediately disabled. But we also can't really see that it's a member. We've got a warning that says, hey, this is a restricted management administrative unit member on the user. But when you go click down, okay, well, what administrative units is that? It won't show anything. It'll look like they're not a member of an AU. So we've got to figure that out. They've also been able to reset passwords and MFA on certain users that we really didn't want them to target, and we can't figure out how they did that either. There was a log from a while ago showing that, oh yeah, there was a scoped role assignment made over this administrative unit, but again, when we go look at that hidden membership administrative unit with the security role in this case, it looks empty. It doesn't look like the scope of the permissions has anyone in it, but it's still active, it's still working. What can we do about this? In terms of what to monitor, there's all of these are going to be under the Entra ID audit logs in the core directory service. So the administrative unit category has a lot of really interesting events. I highly recommend checking them out on Microsoft's site. Ones of interest for this attack technique would be related to adding users to administrative units, adding members to administrative units, things like that. be sure to have the right event names, because if you don't have all the correct event names, then a different way of adding something may skip it, which is exactly why I want to talk about role management. The event names would involve a scoped member assignment. So in this case, just make sure if you're detecting on add member to role, make sure that you've got add scoped member to role as well. I'm out of time, but you can delete an AU in order to remediate it. A recap's available here. We'll have the slides online as well. Big blog post with all the details on security labs. Highly recommend you play with Stratus a bit as well. And those links that I mentioned about permissions are available. And aside from that, thank you for your time.
All right, so we have 2 questions from the Slack, and I'm going to sit down to read them. Did Microsoft ever have an explanation as to why group membership isn't visible and visible to the security team? Sorry if that was covered in your talk.
So in terms of the hidden, I'm guessing the hidden membership of an AU, why that wouldn't be visible to a security role. In this case, I believe I'm guessing that there's a level of sensitivity there that you'd want to hide from the majority of users. There's a similar feature of hidden membership for exchange groups that I think for certain enterprises, they might have like sensitive investigations, things like that. That's my guess. There isn't a formal explanation available at this time, though.
Got it. Second question, can we use these powers, quote unquote, for good by putting some users into these hidden groups to keep a help desk member from modifying protected users? I.e. help desk can't reset MFA password on a user if they don't show up in an AU.
That's pretty interesting. I hadn't thought of that specific case, but you can absolutely use AUs for good, and you should. I missed that slide in our crunch. There's more info on the blog that we've just released.
Can you bring it up and go back? Yeah.
Oh, I don't have the slide, but the blog, yeah, the blog slide. So that write-up we've got on Datadog Security Labs would have details on how you can use restricted management AUs to protect your users, and then scope assignments as well to make sure that your help desk isn't going a little crazy.
Cool. Are there any questions from the room?
Thank you, Katie. Great talk. Just a quick one. If we've got a dynamic membership admin unit, does the hidden membership property work in the same way? And if it does, can lower privileged users still get the dynamic membership rules and infer the membership from that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I haven't looked at it in a while, but the membership should still be hidden. In terms of the dynamic rule, that would be part of the properties, though, so a lesser privileged user could see it.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thanks for the talk. I'm not so familiar with Azure, but one question regarding the testing of all the graphs and permissions. Is there a tool to test that, or was it built by your own?
Yeah, fantastic question. There's a tool to test permissions in Entra a little bit more formally that SpectreOps released called Bark. It's in PowerShell. For me, I wasn't able to use it effectively because I'm not great at PowerShell, but I used Terraform for this case. Thank you for asking that. There's no release. It's a lot of sloppy code, but hopefully more to come in the future.
Go ahead, Paul. Yeah, hi, Katie. Sorry.
Over here.
You finished? Yeah. Hi. Yeah, thanks for the talk. No, Katie, I really enjoyed that. So am I right in thinking that, from one of your slides, that it's impossible to access that a hidden user with the Graph API?
Yeah, so if I were reaching out with the Graph API to get the membership of an administrative unit, and I didn't have the right role, then it would just come back empty. It wouldn't say anything like hidden membership. It would just be an empty response that looks like in that portal when we were seeing there's no members.
Yeah, but specifically with the Graph API, you couldn't. It looked like you couldn't construct a Graph API request that would ever bring back. Is that correct, or?
Almost. So the Graph API would be used by the portal in the background, and then if we made a call to the Graph API to say, "Hey, give me the members of this administrative unit," if it had hidden membership enabled and we didn't have one of those 9 roles, then it would just come back as like bracket left, bracket right, and just empty.
Thank you for the fantastic finding. What permissions do you require to create those hidden administrative units? Is it available for everyone who's able to modify administrative units or create them, or does it require elevated privilege to create those?
Yep. The permissions to modify and create any administrative units will always be global admin or privileged role admin, which thank goodness, right? Because they're pretty crazy.
Hi, thanks for that talk. And do you know if any of the sort of defensive tooling like Defender or the third parties look for things like creating a hidden AU or changing its membership almost as a high priority alert? Because, I don't know, once you've set it up once, I almost want to know if anyone ever creates more.
Not that I'm aware of. It may be something that they have in the future. You are able to look for specifically the creation of restricted management administrative units, an addition of members, things like that, in order to detect it in your own environment, though. And then we've got those specific events on the blog that you can reference.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you, Katie. And we'll have Kat in about 5 minutes.
Thank you so much.